Okay, so now we are done with the circulatory system. We talked about general stuff in the circulatory system, different kinds of animals. We talked about different animals with different numbers of chambers of the heart. We talked about single circulation and double circulation. Then we talked about the pulmonary versus systemic circuits and double circulation within mammals. We talked about the heart, all of the chambers and the vessels and the pathway of the blood through the heart and through the pulmonary and systemic circuits. And then we ended up talking about blood pressure, the components of blood, and how blood cells exchange gases with the rest of the body. Also, we talked about capillaries, especially filtration, and then finally the lymphatic system. So now we are finally going to talk about gas exchange and respiration. And remember that circulation and gas exchange are closely linked because gas exchange occurs within capillaries, which is part of the circulatory system. All right. So gas exchange is the uptake of oxygen from the environment and the discharge of carbon dioxide into the environment. And this is specifically when you're talking about animal gas exchange. So, and it occurs across specialized respiratory surfaces. So the respiratory surface would be something like lungs or gills. Depending on what type of animal you are, you will have a different sort of respiratory medium. So as terrestrial mammals, our respiratory medium or our environment that we use to get our oxygen is air. Breathing air is actually relatively easy. There's a lot of oxygen in air. When you compare it to water being your respiratory medium, which is what fish and other aquatic organisms have to use, there's a lot less oxygen in water. In fact, there's about 20 times more oxygen in air than there is in water. So water is pretty low in oxygen in comparison to air. So if you are an aquatic organism using water as your respiratory medium, you probably need to have a pretty efficient system for getting oxygen out of that water. So there's all kinds of different gas exchange organs or respiratory surfaces. Some of these you may not know about. I'm sure you have heard of gills and lungs. So gills like in the salamander, or gills are also used in fish, and actually a lot of aquatic invertebrates have gills. Lungs are what mammals have, and lots of other vertebrate species have lungs. But there's other respiratory surfaces as well. So gas exchange will always take place in the respiratory surfaces by diffusion. And we did talk about that before. The exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, both of these things can easily move across a cell membrane. So diffusion is the way that carbon dioxide and oxygen are going to move around. But the respiratory surfaces, even though they're all doing this exchange between carbon dioxide and oxygen, respiratory surfaces are going to vary a lot. So if you're just a single cell surface, you don't need a respiratory surface, you don't need a gas exchange organ. Basically, the surface of the cell is the only thing that you need to do gas exchange, okay? So like a single-celled organism can do gas exchange just through the surface. If you are an annelid or a type of worm, remember they do have a closed circulatory system, which we talked about, but their respiratory surface is their skin. So you've got all these little capillary beds along the skin close to the edges of their body and close to the air. So oxygen and carbon dioxide can just diffuse across the skin and get into or out of the circulatory system. We have gills right here where gas exchange occurs between the gills and the aquatic environment, which is shown here. One that we haven't talked about before is in insects. They have something called tracheae, and those are sort of infolds from the skin which branch out and essentially come in contact with or get very close to all of the cells of the body. So you basically have these openings where air can get in, and that sort of connects the external environment of air to the different cells inside the insect. So those are tracheae, and again, the same gases are being exchanged. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about lungs, so I don't need to go into detail there. So all of these gas exchange organs have similar requirements, whether it's skin or gills or lungs or tracheae. These need to be characteristics that all of them have. First of all, they need a high surface area to volume ratio. All that does is it increases the amount of space that's available for gas exchange to occur, and the more area there is, surface area there is, the better gas exchange will be. So in a lot of cases, you'll see gas exchange organs with a bunch of folds or branches, or they're really filamentous. So if we were to go back to the previous slide, you can see there's all these branches on the gills, all these different branches of the tracheae, all the ridges in the worm, and all these branches that are coming off of the bronchioles, which we'll talk about later, in the lungs. All of those are ways to increase the surface area to volume ratio and to facilitate gas exchange. So the next thing that gas exchange organs have to have is they must be in contact with the internal transport system, which is the circulatory system. So that means that they need to be highly vascularized. Again, that basically just means there needs to be capillary beds associated with the gas exchange organs. So there's going to be a lot of capillary beds around little structures within the lungs. You can see these are highly vascularized gills, which makes them pink because that's from the blood. In the last slide, you saw that the capillaries were really close to the gas exchange organ of skin in the worms. They must lack scales or exoskeleton or fur, so they can't have coverings on them. They need to be exposed to whatever the medium is, the gas exchange medium, the water or the air. So that means that gas exchange organs are typically unprotected. They are thin so that carbon dioxide and oxygen can move across the membranes really easily, and they're typically very fragile. In many cases, but they have to be exposed to the medium. In the case of lungs, they're exposed to the medium because you breathe air in and they fill up the lungs, so that's how they're exposed. But they're still protected by being inside our rib cage. Okay, so they are fragile, but they are encompassed within our body, which keeps them safe. Also, gills are very fragile and they're exposed, but there's little gill flaps that fish have that cover up the gills that protects them when they're not actively being used. In some cases, like in those salamanders where they have the big fluffy gills, they cannot do anything to protect those, and actually that is a common place where like fish might come and bite their gills because they need to be exposed to the medium and there's no way to protect those. Gas exchange organs also have to be kept moist, so there needs to be some moisture, and again, that's going to facilitate gas exchange. If they're completely dried out, even inside the insect, the tracheae need to have some moisture in there, or else gas exchange diffusion cannot happen. And finally, they have to be kept ventilated, and that means, again, there needs to be sort of a constant flow of the gas exchange medium going across the gas exchange organ so that there's a constant flow of oxygen or a constant way to get rid of the carbon dioxide. So let's talk a little bit about gills. Gills are outfoldings of the body. Okay, so those are extensions coming out of the body, and they have large surface area for gas exchange. You can see all these little filaments which increase the surface area. In terms of ventilation, What that means is ventilation is when you move the respiratory medium over the respiratory surface. So we kind of talked about that in the last slide where we said they have to be kept ventilated. Ventilation is, again, the movement of the medium over the respiratory surface. So in gills, the respiratory surface is gills and the respiratory medium is water. One way that, well, there's actually several ways that aquatic animals ventilate their gills, just depends. So fish often swim with their mouth open, which moves water through their mouth and out through their gills, and that's how they ventilate their gills. Or they might have little structures that they use to wave water across their gills. And so these aquatic invertebrates usually have some sort of structure that moves the water around so that water can constantly be moving over their gills. Fish gills are super efficient. They use something called countercurrent exchange, and this is going to be really different from the way lungs work. They use this countercurrent exchange system, and I don't want you to stress about it too much because these figures are kind of confusing. But what you need to know is that the blood in the capillaries within the gills are moving in the opposite direction of the water when it's flowing through the gills. Okay, so the blood is moving this way, and the water, the oxygenated water, is moving this way. Okay, so you don't need to sort of figure out how functionally that works through a gill. You just need to know that blood's moving one way and the water is moving the opposite way. This is a super efficient way of getting oxygen out of the water. And remember, we talked about water having low oxygen, and so you need really efficient respiratory surface to get enough oxygen. So I'm going to talk about the mechanism in just a second, but fish gills can take more than 80% of the oxygen that's in water. They can take more than 80% of it out and put it into their bloodstream, which is a lot more than what we can do. I think we do something like 40%. So I'm going to look at this figure a little bit more on the next slide to help you understand how that works. All right, don't worry about this. This is, again, just showing that water is moving one way and blood is flowing the other way. But look at this. Okay, so in this case, we have blood flowing here. Okay, this is basically the capillary bed. Here's deoxygenated blood flowing into the gills. Here is the blood going through the gills, and here's the blood leaving the gills, and it's going to go back to the systemic part of the fish. If you have water flowing this way, fresh water flowing this way, and blood flowing this way, what you have is a constant differential in terms of the amount of oxygen. There's always more oxygen in the water than there is in the blood. So even though this blood is sort of at the end of the capillary and it's about to flow back to the rest of the body and give oxygenated blood all over the place, it has a lot of blood, but it's lining up next to water that has a bunch of oxygen. So water is going to be moving into the oxygen is going to be moving into the capillary here. And then as it loses some oxygen from the water, it's still lined up with a capillary that has less oxygen in it. So oxygen is going to flow from the water into the capillary. Even when the water doesn't have a lot of oxygen in it, it still has more oxygen than this blood, which is completely deoxygenated. Okay, so this countercurrent flow means that you have this very efficient transfer of oxygen from the water to the blood along the entire capillary. And that's really different from any other respiratory surface. So that's what makes the gills in fish a very efficient respiratory surface. Okay, so now we're going to talk about lungs. Lungs are an infolding of the body surface, and remember, gills were an outfolding of the body surface. So lungs are internalized. They vary a lot in terms of their size and complexity depending on what animal you're looking at and what their metabolic rate is. So if they need a bunch of energy, which means they need a lot of oxygen to create that energy, then you're going to have a more complex lung, which will facilitate a greater amount of oxygen for your body. Now, you may not know this, but it probably makes sense that birds have a super high metabolic rate. They use a bunch of energy for flying. Look at their lung. It's got all these different air sacs. It's super, super complicated. So they probably have the most complex lung of all vertebrates. Frogs, they have lungs, but remember they also get some gas exchange through their skin. So, and they're amphibians. So that means they're ectotherms. They don't have very much of a metabolism. So they have relatively simple lungs with some infoldings, but certainly nowhere near as complex as like a bird would. And you should also know that there are some organisms that you would not expect that also have lungs, like invertebrates. So, for example, land snails and spiders have lungs. This is a spider and this is a book lung. You can see it's pretty simplified. It's not very complicated. But for all organisms with lungs, whether or not they have an open or closed circulatory system, remember these arachnids actually have an open circulatory system, and so do land snails. But the circulatory system in everything with a lung is responsible for transporting the gases between the lungs and the rest of the body. And remember, the lungs are where the circulatory system is going to pick up oxygen. And then the oxygen is going to get transported through the rest of the body in the blood or hemolymph, depending on what you're talking about, through the circulatory system. Okay, so that's the end of that one, and I believe the next is our last lecture.